Well, hey everybody, it's Peter Schiff. It is Tuesday, February 23rd, 2010. Well, the news today, at least for the markets, was the Consumer Confidence Index that came out, which dropped, I think, down to like 45, something like that, from 55. It was a 10-month low, and that was cited as the reason for the weakness in stocks today. The Dow was down about 100 points. Gold dropped, I think, $10, $12 an ounce. Commodities were lower. The dollar firmed against all the currencies other than the yen, against which it fell. And, the Wall Street spin on this is every time consumer confidence comes out, Wall Street wants consumers to be confident, even if that confidence is not warranted by the fundamentals. See, Wall Street doesn't just want confidence. They want recklessness. They want extravagance. They want consumers out there spending money. That's why they're worried about confidence. They want to know that people are confident that even though there's a lot of people unemployed, and even though they might lose their jobs, even though they've lost their home equity and they have no savings, Wall Street wants everybody spending money anyway. The reality is that's not what we want. Consumers shouldn't be confident. If anything, their overconfidence is why we're in trouble. They spent money they didn't have. They believed in a false recovery or a false prosperity that wasn't genuine. I don't want consumers being confident. I want them being worried, and they should be. There's no reason. Why should they have confidence in this economy? They should be saving their money. And even if they had confidence in the future, they should still save because they're broke. So the best thing that can happen to the economy in the long run is that consumers hunker down. They get realistic about the outlook for the economy and their futures, and they save money. They stop spending. And if that means that retail sales drop in the short run and some companies have to scale back, they have to lay off some workers, or they have to shut down some locations, that's what has to happen. That is part of the necessary restructuring in order to have a real recovery. We can't keep spending money we don't have in order to support a retail sector that's too big, a financial services sector that's too big. We have to allow the economy to restructure, and consumers losing confidence is part of that process. We can't keep spending like there's never going to be a rainy day. The sun's not shining. We need to save money. And so I wish Wall Street would get this story straight for a change. But of course, I'm not going to hold my breath on that. Talking about people not getting things straight, I happen to be watching the Sunday morning talk shows. And I think it was this week with Stephanopoulos on ABC, but they were interviewing governors. Arnold Schwarzenegger from California was one, and I forget who the other governor was. Maybe he was from Pennsylvania or another industrial northeastern state. And both of these guys agreed that the government needs to help create jobs, and the best way to create jobs is to spend money on infrastructure. And this is a old myth that is not true. You don't do infrastructure projects to create jobs. The benefit of infrastructure isn't that we have to, hire people to do it. That's part of the cost. Because the people who are working on the infrastructure, now they're not doing something else. They're building an infrastructure instead where the benefit doesn't accrue until after the project is completed. And of course, that's only if the project has merit, if it actually makes our lives better, if it makes our economy more efficient. If we simply build a bridge to nowhere, then we've wasted our resources. We derive no benefit from the infrastructure, and people are wasting their labor. They could have been doing something more productive, and instead they worked in infrastructure. And of course, what the governors don't understand is where is the money coming from to finance this infrastructure spending? And what projects are not being done? Because the government is simply diverting resources from one sector of the economy to make them available to finance infrastructure. They're taking labor that would have been doing something else and redeploy it towards infrastructure. Now, they're going to make the argument that, well, the labor is idle anyway. They're unemployed workers. Well, you know what? Putting people to work in infrastructure isn't going to create new jobs for the unemployed people. It's simply going to change the nature of the jobs. And my guess would be we'd actually end up destroying more productive jobs and supplanting them with less productive jobs on infrastructure projects that we might not even need. And granted, there is a lot of infrastructure that we do need. We have underinvested in infrastructure for a long time. That's a problem. In the meantime, we've benefited because we've been able to use those resources to indulge ourselves for more current consumption. To the extent that we have to spend money on infrastructure, that's not going to be a help to the economy. That's actually going to be a burden on the economy. It might be a burden that we need to bear. It's a burden that is long overdue, but it's not going to be a quick fix. It's not going to be a panacea. I mean, these guys think that, if we had a major disaster, if we had a major earthquake in California that destroyed a bunch of houses, that somehow this would be good for the economy because we would be creating jobs to rebuild them. That is all a nonsense. And we have to move away from that way of thinking. And it's too bad that Governor Schwarzenegger and his colleague still don't understand that governments can't create jobs and that government spending isn't the way back to prosperity. We need to shrink government. We need to make government smaller so that it's a smaller burden on the private sector so we can have genuine growth, genuine prosperity, and genuine job creation. Also, I wanted to comment on, I read a story today in Bloomberg about quoting Alan Greenspan. One of the things Alan Greenspan said in his quotes was that the financial crisis that we had is the worst in history. It's even worse than what happened in 1929 that led to the Great Depression. He said even though the economy isn't as bad as it was in the Depression, that the financial crisis is worse. Now, of course, we have to give this some time because ultimately I believe that the economy will be worse than it was during the 1930s. But of course, one of the things that Greenspan refuses to acknowledge is responsibility for the financial crisis. Because the reason we had the worst financial crisis in history is because he was the worst Fed chairman in history. He produced it. If you go back to my book, Crash Proof, and look at the introduction, and I'm hoping that everybody who's watching this video blog has read Crash Proof. If you haven't read it, go out and buy a copy. Certainly buy Crash Proof 2.0 now. You don't need to buy the original. But my introduction was dedicated to Greenspan. The first paragraph was a Greenspan quote. And of course, I wrote the book in 2005, 2006, when Greenspan was still so highly regarded as the maestro. Everybody was singing his praises. And I basically blamed him for the economic collapse that I said was coming and was the reason I wrote the book. And I laid out my case for the bursting of the financial bubble and the financial crisis that would ensue when all the lenders went bankrupt and this whole house of cards collapsed. And I put the blame for this impending disaster squarely at Alan Greenspan, when Alan Greenspan at the time was still denying that the crisis was even possible. Now, also I want to quote one other thing that he said. I have it here about subprime market to show you that this guy, how clueless Alan Greenspan is. Here's what he says, quote, "I hope we can find a way of resurrecting the subprime market because it was working well until those mortgages were widely securitized." Unbelievable. The subprime market was never working well. It was a bad idea from the beginning. It's not a good idea to help people buy houses that they can't afford. And that's what the subprime market was all about. The reason that the subprime market had to be securitized is because they ran out of real buyers. All securitization enabled was for the subprime bubble to get even bigger. Had Wall Street not figured out a way to securitize subprime mortgages, the mortgages would have collapsed sooner. And it would have been a smaller crisis because there wouldn't have been as many of them. So it was a ticking time bomb the whole time. It never was working well. The fact that Alan Greenspan, who everybody thinks is so smart, even in hindsight, still can't understand that subprime mortgages were a bad idea from day one. Because, of course, in the beginning, Alan Greenspan was applauding subprime mortgages. He thought it was a great idea. He thought it was Wall Street being taking the initiative, creating things, expanding home ownership, making all this possible. He was praising all this, but of course none of it would have been possible were it not for the government and the Federal Reserve policies that distorted the market and caused everybody to be so irrational in the first place. Anyway, that's it for today. I'll be back again soon. Take care, everybody.